Now, with that said, another aspect of this verse that's very important is the fact that that verse in John's Gospel makes clear that this is a miracle of multiplication. What do I mean? Well, notice what John says there, that they fill the 12 baskets, not just with any fragments of bread, but with fragments that came from the 5 barley loaves that were left by those who had eaten. So, I'm no mathematician, but you can't get 12 baskets of bread from fragments of 5 barley loaves unless there's some miracle of multiplication. And this is how the church has always interpreted this verse, that Jesus takes the bread and miraculously multiplies it, so that he's not only able to feed the people from the 5 loaves, but that there's actually fragments left over from those 5 loaves. They all have their source in those original 5 loaves. So there's the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves. That's why it's interpreted as a miracle. I just bring this up for 2 reasons. First, if you look at all 4 gospel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, it never explicitly narrates the miracle. It doesn't say, "Then Jesus multiplied the loaves," or it doesn't describe how the miracle happened. It's John's Gospel that makes clear the miracle with this verse when it says that the fragments were gathered from the 5 barley loaves. Okay? So, this is the verse that makes clear it's a miracle of multiplication. The second reason I bring it up is because, since the 19th century, a competing interpretation of this particular passage has become very popular in Europe and in the United States and in North America and the West. In this interpretation, you've probably heard it before, or at least you may have heard about it. Argues that what is actually happening in the feeding of the 5,000 is a miracle of sharing. Okay? If you haven't heard of this interpretation, let me just articulate it for just a second. According to this view, although most people think that this is a miracle of multiplication, what actually happened was a miracle of sharing. According to this view, what took place was that in the 1st century AD, supposedly, Jewish people would carry loaves of bread and things like that with them on their person, in their garments or whatnot. And that when the crowd saw the willingness of the young boy to share his loaves and fish, they were moved to be generous rather than selfish and to share their own food. So what happened was everyone ended up with enough to eat whenever people stopped being selfish and started to be generous. When they were inspired to generosity, both by the model of the boy or also perhaps by Jesus's generosities, he began to share what the little boy had given. And you'll frequently find that version of the miracle preached in contemporary European and American churches. What's the problem with that? Well, it's completely unsound in terms of just exegesis, interpretation of the text. First and foremost, you'll notice we just read very carefully through the text. Did it say anything about Jewish people carrying bread in their garments? Did it say anything about the crowd being moved by the example of the boy? Did it say anything about them sharing their food? No. You have to read that totally into the text. It's called eisegesis. Scholars draw a difference between eisegesis, which is where you read something into the text that is completely absent, and exegesis, where you draw out the meaning that's actually in the text. In this case, exegesis makes clear that Jesus here is performing a miracle multiplication, and that the 12 baskets being filled with fragments from the 5 loaves is in fact a miraculous multiplication. That's the point of the story. And you can actually see that from the way the crowd reacts. If you look at the next verse, verse 14, it says, "When the people saw the sign which Jesus had done." And in John's Gospel, signs are always miracles. When he saw the sign which he had done, they didn't say, "He has taught us how to share." They said, "This is the prophet who is to come into the world." Now in Judaism, the prophet isn't just any prophet. It's the prophet like Moses. This is an allusion to Deuteronomy chapter 18. So if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18 in the Old Testament, real quick, there's a very important prophecy of the new Moses, the prophet like Moses. It says this, "The Lord said to Moses, quote, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him." So when the people say, "This is the prophet who is to come into the world," they're saying, "This is the prophet. like Moses. Why do they say that? Well, because in the Old Testament, what does Moses do? He gives a crowd of Israelites in the desert miraculous bread from heaven. He feeds the multitudes with miraculous bread. So when Jesus comes and performs a miracle, they say, "This is the guy. This is the new Moses," right? Not, "He has taught us how to share with one another." If you want more details on that, I go into it in my book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, and I show there how the Jews were actually waiting for the Messiah to be a new Moses. In any case here, you might be wondering at this point, well, wait, where did this interpretation come from? The idea of it's really about a miracle of sharing. Well, that's an interesting story. And most people don't know this, but I want to be sure everyone's informed about it because of the popularity that interpretation has taken. That view was devised in the 19th century by a German Protestant scholar named Heinrich Eberhard Gottlieb Paulus, right? That was his name, H.E.G. Paulus. He was German, obviously. Heinrich Eberhard Gottlieb is a German name, and he was a rationalist. He was a Protestant rationalist. And rationalism is a philosophy that says that all we can know is what reason alone can tell us, in other words, not faith. And also, more importantly, rationalism denies that miracles and prophecy are possible. It denies all miraculous events, like the virginal conception, or the bodily resurrection, or the feeding of the 5,000, the miraculous multiplication of the loaves. So let me just summarize Paulus' interpretation here for just a minute. In another German scholar's book, Albert Schweitzer, he summarized Paulus' interpretation, and this is what Paulus claimed happened. Quote, "When Jesus saw the multitude, he says to his disciples, 'We will set the rich people among them a good example, that they may share their supplies with the others.' And he began to distribute his own provisions and those of the disciples to the people who were sitting near them. The example had its effect, and soon there was plenty for everyone." End quote. Now, why did Paulus argue from that? Notice, we just read John. Did you hear anything about rich people? Did you hear anything about them holding back and then being moved to share? No, that's all being made up out of whole cloth. That's being read into the text. But the reason Paulus came up with that interpretation was, as a rationalist, he couldn't believe in an actual miraculous multiplication of the loaves. So he had to come up with a purely naturalistic explanation, one that didn't involve any miracle, that just involved human agency and human actions. So he made up the idea that these rich Jewish people began to share their food, and then everyone was moved by the example of Jesus. As I've said before, there are two big problems with that. First, it's nowhere in the text. Second, it's motivated by a false philosophy. As Catholics, we do not believe in rationalism. We do not believe that miracles are impossible or that prophecy is impossible. The very articles of the Creed anchored in the belief in the miraculous conception of Jesus, the virginal conception, and also his miraculous resurrection from the dead, to say nothing of his miracles throughout his public ministry. So I just want to point out to you the false philosophy behind that interpretation, of the fact that it's exegetically groundless. And then one other thing, and I think this is important to know, Heinrich Paulus was writing in the 19th century in Germany, and he was also anti-Semitic. So there's an implicit anti-Semitism in this interpretation too, in which many people who took this view depicted the rich Jewish people as being selfish, and they needed to be moved by the humble poverty of Jesus and his disciples. So this interpretation is problematic on all kinds of levels. It's based on a false philosophy, has no grounding in the text, and it's also implicitly anti-Semitic. In other words, it depicts the Jewish people, the Jewish crowds, as being both selfish and wealthy, neither of which is anywhere stated in the text whatsoever. My hope is that this interpretation of this passage dies a quick death and needs to go away fast, because it really is an irresponsible interpretation of the text in every way, shape, and form. It's also important to point out that with regard to the Catholic Church, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church itself, paragraph 1335, the Church makes clear that the multiplication of the loaves being described is in fact a miracle. So Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1335, says this. So notice, the Catechism is very clear there that it is a miracle of multiplication, not a quote-unquote miracle of sharing. That's a false interpretation.